So I'm Beth Currans. I'm from Eastern Michigan University, where I'm in the Women's and Gender Studies department. And what I'm presenting today is part of a larger project, and I mean that in a couple of ways. First of all, it's part of my book project, and my manuscript is hopefully in the loving hands of very attentive reviewers right now. So hopefully this will be in the process soon. And the book is called Holding Space: Gender, Sexuality, and Public Protests in Contemporary North America. And what I'm presenting from today is part of the epilogue to that. And for this section of the research, I looked at slut walks. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about today is the Toronto slut walk. I also say this is part of a larger work because that chapter actually has two intertwined themes. One that examines the relationship between protests that are happening in physical spaces where people are engaging with each other face to face, and then the conversations that happen about that online, and then how those conversations online affect, future protests. But in the process of doing that, I ended up getting really interested in how feminists talk to and about each other online. And given the constraints of time, I'm going to mostly talk about that latter part of this project, although you probably hear hints of the other piece as I go along. So in terms of my methods, I generally interview people and I do participant observation of events. And so what you're going to hear primarily is about my interviews with the organizers for the Toronto Slut Walk, some who organized in 2011, some in 2011 and 12. But you'll also hear quite a bit of my media analysis of that. So that's primarily what I'm drawing from. And in thinking about this in relationship to what we're doing here in this symposium, I think there's a lot of relationships between online communities and protests. And I think some of my co-panelists are going to be bringing up different aspects of that. But we can talk about hacktivism or petitions that are circulated online. We can think about how new media facilitates protests, say in the Arab Spring. But what I'm really interested in is how digital media gives us a window into something that I think people have always done in feminist organizing, which is to have conversations with each other about whether what we're doing is working or not. And so that's the piece I'm taking on that I think links into this larger conversation we're having. So in spring 2011, reports about a new form of women-dominated public demonstration began emerging on my Facebook feed and on electronic listservs that I subscribed to. And this first slut walk, which is a picture of it up here, happened in Toronto. And very quickly, we started to see various media conversations, but also additional slut walks popping up across the globe. Places like Brazil, India, New Zealand, Kazakhstan, of course throughout the US, South Africa, all kinds of places. And according to Toronto organizers, and I have yet to follow through to see if they're right on this, actually Latin America has been the place where the most slut walks have taken place and there's been the most productive conversation. Again, I haven't had the chance to follow through on that, but that's something I'm interested in doing. But these marches really set the stage for an electronic debate about gender, sexuality, race, and appropriate responses to violence. So just for those who don't know, in January 2011, 2 Toronto police officers spoke to a group of law students at York University in Toronto during a forum about public safety. One of the officers, Michael Sanguinetti, said, "I've been told I shouldn't say this, but women should stop dressing like sluts to avoid being victimized." The student newspaper reported the comment, which quickly spread via print and primarily electronic sources. One of the co-organizers of that first event, Heather Jarvis, who's a white, queer-identified woman in her late 20s, learned about the incident on Facebook. She explained, "I reshared the article, saying, 'This makes me want to go down to Toronto Police Headquarters and bang on their door and tell them to do better.' And one of my friends, Sonia Barnett, said, 'I think that's a good idea. I think you should do it.' So later that day, we were texting back and forth, and she said, 'I can help you.' And we started tossing around ideas, and she was talking to a colleague who asked, 'What are you going to call it, a slut walk?' And she said to me, 'What do you think about calling this a slut walk?' And I said, 'Done, let's do this.' So her story is totally wrapped up in digital media. We've got texting, we've got Facebook, etc. And so they hooked up with some students from York University, and 3 months later, the 5 of them organized and hosted the first slut walk. The media responded immediately. Even before the march, the Toronto Star learned they were planning a response and reported it. News outlets throughout North America were calling them for interviews weeks and months before they actually marched. And this criticism, even beforehand, was pretty diverse and multifaceted. Even beforehand, there was anti-feminist critique, there was feminist critique, there was a lot of support, all kinds of things happening. Once the march happened, one of the organizers said to me, I thought everything was gonna calm down. But after the march, the critiques just grew and grew and grew. And so what I'm gonna talk about today are what I identified as feminist critiques. There was a lot of anti-feminist critiques, threatening stoning, death, other charming things. There's also a lot of feminist supporting things. I'm not gonna talk about the support. I'm not gonna talk about the anti-feminist critique. I'm gonna talk about what I identified as feminist critiques. And what I noticed was that these fell into 3 categories, which I have up here. I ended up talking about condemning, supportively critical, and those that actually encourage dialogue. And I split these up also into looking at 2 different themes of these. A lot we're focusing on sexual norms, and a lot we're talking about intersectional identities, particularly talking about the role of race. And what I started noticing was the ones focused on sexual norms were the ones, primarily the ones outright condemning this, although there was one intersectional critique that did that as well. We see supportively critical coming from both perspectives, and the only ones that actually encouraged dialogue were 2 very closely interrelated critiques. One was a well-known letter from Black Women's Blueprint, and one was a blog post by one of the co-signatories. And just so you know, this is tiny, and I know, but I wanted it on one slide. These are the things I'm talking about if you're interested. But do people want to look at this or the other thing more? Because I was going to point something out on the other thing. The other one? Okay. So in certain ways, some of these are really gray areas. Like there's a couple things I put under supportively critical that landed there because of one single sentence. So primarily this would say, I have issues with this, 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 and this. However, I'm glad that people are doing this for this reason. So there's at least 2 things here that all barely miss being in the top category. Something else to note is that most of these people are US-based critics, which was a big deal for the Toronto folks. Harsha Walia, who's over here in supportively critical, Megan Murphy, who's up there in condemning, someone who blogs just as Jill, are Canadian. All the rest are folks from the US. So I'm not going to talk about that much, but that was a big deal for Toronto organizers, feeling like people from the US didn't completely understand their cultural context. So I'm just going to go give you a quick example of each of these. The first one I'm going to talk about is one of the condemning ones. This is by a blogger named Kathy Miriam. Her piece was later printed in Feminist Studies in a special section on the Slut Walk, an altered version of it. But this to me was one of the quintessential, this is completely irredeemable, these people should stop posts. And part of this, what I'm going to read is up here, part of it's later in the post, but she says that the feminist outrage spurred by the comment was fierce and a terrible thing to waste, which is precisely what happened when outrage against victim blaming in a rape culture was and is redirected and defused into shallow and bubble-headed libertarian credo. Her punchline at the end was that the only thing that was being parodied in the Slut Walk was feminism itself. The next piece I'm going to show you is, I thought, a really good example of what was supportively critical. This is written by a woman who blogs as Crunktastic as part of the Crunk Feminist Collective. She wrote 2 posts. Her second post is one of the ones that barely made it, almost made it into the condemning category, and I'm happy to talk about that during the question and answer if people are interested. But this was one of those really, I think, smart, I'm critical, but I want to grant that there's something positive going on here. And she points out that she believes that Black women's histories are different in that Black female sexuality has always been understood from without to be deviant, hyper, and excessive. Therefore, the word slut has not been to use to discipline, shame us, this is a quote from her, and to chase moral categories, as we have largely been understood to be unable to practice normal and chaste sexuality anyway. She goes on to say, I'd prefer that white women acknowledge that they are in fact organizing around a problematic use of terminology endemic to white communities and culture. In so doing, this would force an acknowledgement that the experience of womanhood being defended here, that of white women, is not universal, but is under attack and worthy of being defended all the same. So I think hers was probably the most eloquent, that said, this is not a universal way of responding, but there's a subject position here that's under attack, and yes, that's a legitimate position to defend, but it is not universal, and they need to acknowledge it. And then the final one comes from Black Women's Blueprint. They had a long letter that I think is probably the most widely circulated criticism of Slut Walk, and they shared a lot that Crunktastic and a lot of the other women of color bloggers had to say in terms of the critique of the word slut and these kinds of things. But the big difference was, and this is at the bottom here, they point out that they would welcome a meeting with the organizers of Slut Walk to discuss the intrinsic potential in its global reach and the sheer number of followers it has energized. We'd welcome the opportunity to engage in critical conversation with the organizers of Slut Walk about strategies for remaining accountable to the thousands of women and men, marchers it left behind in Brazil, in New Delhi, South Korea, and elsewhere, marchers who continue to need safety and resources, marchers who went back home to their communities and their lives. We would welcome a conversation about the work ahead and how this can be done together with groups across various boundaries to end sexual assault beyond the marches. So according to two of the organizers, including Heather Jarvis and Reza Bouyan, this was particularly important. And what they said about that was a little different, but they did in fact have a conversation with Black Women's Blueprint. They reported it somewhat differently about how conversational or tense that conversation was, but they both credit the conversation they had on the phone with Black Women's Blueprint to them really moving forward to doing Slut Walk Toronto 2012 differently. And in many ways, it's hard to tell the difference other than the weather was a little warmer. But the march was quite similar in many ways. It still had the kind of playful vibe that I find to be what makes a Slut Walk different than a Take Back the Night in certain ways. Something that felt a little similar to a Dyke March to me, in fact, even though it's not explicitly focused on queer issues. But the big difference was the lineup of speakers they had pulled from First Nations communities, from immigrant communities, particularly Muslim communities, people of African descent. I almost said African American, speaking of U.S. Focused language, right? And that conversation was really very much more vibrant and created a better space. Probably no more women of color attended in the second year than they did the first, although no one has exact numbers on that. And I think some people felt more positive about it, some people felt equally alienated by it, but the conversation definitely facilitated some changes in the march. And so that's all.